This is the disturbing ancient civilization Iceberg explained. Tier 1. Carthage. Phoenicians. Picture a wealthy port city around 300 BC, packed with ships, traders, and people speaking a dozen different languages at once. This is Carthage, a powerful city on the North African coast near modern-day Tunisia. It was founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers, seafaring traders from the eastern Mediterranean who built colonies wherever their ships could dock safely. Back in the day, Carthage was rich, powerful, and kind of a big deal. Its navy controlled major sea routes. Its merchants moved goods across North Africa, Spain, and Sicily, and the money poured in. Trade paid for the ships boosted the economy, and the city grew even richer. The Carthaginians believed their gods controlled all of it. Baal Haman oversaw fertility, weather, and crops, while Tanit protected the city. When trade thrived, harvests were good, and enemies stayed away. It meant the gods were satisfied. If disaster struck, it meant something or someone had upset the divine duo. In Carthage, the way to deal with angry gods was always payment. Most of the time, it was simple stuff. Animals, food, little gifts, things people could spare without losing too much sleep. But when the city hit a real crisis, famine, war, or even drought, the gods had to be appeased with something a lot more valuable. That's where the place we now know as Tophet comes in. It was a sacred burial ground just outside the city. When archaeologists dug it up, they found over 20,000 urns. Most held babies only weeks or months old, sometimes with a goat thrown into the mix. Many urns had inscriptions thanking Baal and Tanit, basically saying, "Thanks in advance for letting us survive this latest disaster. Here's a gift to make it worth your while." Greek and Roman writers describe what happened during the rituals where the children were sacrificed. According to them, fires burned, music blared to cover the screams, and the ashes were carefully collected into the urns. This wasn't random chaos, it was organized. Wealthy families sometimes offered their firstborns to show devotion and status. In other cases, some citizens brought children from poorer families and raised them specifically for sacrifice. This system went on for centuries until Rome finally attacked in 146 BC, burned the city, enslaved the survivors, and ended the whole thing. To this day, scholars still debate whether every child buried in Tophet was actually sacrificed. But looking at the ages, inscriptions, and timing, it seems likely that most of them were. Moche. You're a captured warrior in 100 AD, and after days of being marched across the Peruvian highland, you find yourself at a massive plaza at Huaca de la Luna temple complex in northern Peru. Thousands of people watch from above as guards strip you, tie your hands behind your back, and force you to your knees. The plaza you're kneeling in belongs to the Moche civilization, one of ancient South America's most advanced cultures. The Moche controlled Peru's northern coast from around 100 to 800 AD, building massive pyramid temples, creating detailed pottery, and engineering irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. They were rival city-states constantly competing for territory and resources. Moche society ran on a strict hierarchy. Warrior priests sat at the top, controlling religious ceremonies and military decisions. Below them came craftspeople who made metalwork and elaborate pottery. And at the bottom were farmers and laborers who worked the fields and maintained the irrigation canals. Their work fed everyone, and it tied directly to the gods. The Moche believed the gods controlled rainfall, fish populations, and crop yields. When harvests were good and weather stayed stable, the gods were happy. When droughts hit, storm destroyed infrastructure, or fish disappeared from the coast, it meant the gods were upset and needed payment in blood. Their main deity was the decapitator god, who's often shown holding a severed head and a knife. He ruled over agriculture and warfare. Other gods controlled the ocean, mountains, and weather. When the gods demanded blood, the Moche turned to ritual combat. Warriors from rival city-states met in organized battles with clubs and shields. Victory meant capturing your opponent by the helmet or hair. Those taken became prisoners, prepared for sacrifice. During crises, the Moche believed only warrior blood would satisfy the gods. The process followed strict steps. Captured warriors were brought to temple complexes, paraded before crowds, stripped and bound. Priests seized their hair, pulled their heads back, and cut their throats with ceremonial knives. As the victims bled out, their blood poured into golden goblets. The priests passed the cups among themselves and drank. Some historians believe these rituals inspired the intricate designs found on Moche pottery. After death, some of the bodies were taken apart. In a few cases, priests even removed the victims' faces, possibly to wear as masks or keep as trophies. Back then, nothing said victory like bringing home someone else's face as a souvenir. During El Niño events, ocean warming threw the climate out of balance. On the Moche coast, that meant heavy rains and flooding that tore up irrigation canals. And once the water settled, long droughts followed and finished off the crops. As things got worse, the Moche increased the sacrifices. They killed more captured warriors, believing more blood would fix what the weather had broken. It didn't fix anything. The climate kept shifting, the disasters kept coming, and by around 800 AD, the system fell apart. Temples were abandoned, the killings stopped, and the culture slowly faded out. Nazca. It's 500 AD, and your village in southern Peru is drying out. Crops are failing, rivers are shrinking, and desperation is settling in. When Nazca warriors arrive from the next valley over, armed with clubs and shields, you realize they're not here to help. They're facing the same crisis, and their priests have decided that the only way to fix it is by offering human heads to the gods, which is why they've come to your village. The Nazca controlled southern Peru's coastal desert valleys from around 100 BC to 800 AD. They built irrigation systems that made the desert farmable, created elaborate pottery and textiles, and constructed ceremonial centers like CAHOKIA, where thousands gathered for festivals. They're most famous now for the Nazca lines, massive geoglyphs carved into the desert, showing animals, plants, and geometric shapes you can only really see from the air. Life in the valleys was mostly peaceful. Each group handled its own water and farmland. When harvests were good, people traded, minded their business, and got along just fine. But the moment the water dropped or crops failed, that peace didn't hold for long. The Nazca believed human heads contained life force and fertility. And so when things got bad, offering heads was meant to send that energy back into the land and bring rain. Because of that, communities organized ritual combat. Warriors faced off with clubs and shields, trying to knock opponents unconscious, captured them, and drag them back to the ceremonial center. At the center, captives were drugged with San Pedro cactus. Once the mescaline kicked in and everything slowed down, priests stepped in and cut their throats. After death, they drilled a hole through the forehead, thread a rope through it, and carried the head around, or hung it up as a trophy. Archaeologists have found over 150 of these trophy heads at Nazca sites. Nazca pottery records the whole process. Warriors are shown holding freshly severed heads, priests carrying them on poles, and rows of heads hanging from ceremonial banners. Other pieces show crops and beans growing directly from trophy heads, reflecting the belief that taking heads brought fertility back to the land. Between 400 and 600 AD, environmental conditions worsened, and the killings became more frequent. Pottery from this period shows more battles and a growing number of trophy heads. As droughts continued, the Nazca took more heads, hoping the bloodshed would bring the rain. It didn't. By around 800 AD, long droughts, deforestation, and a major flood damaged the region beyond recovery. Then, the Nazca civilization collapsed. MUISCA. You're standing at the edge of Lake Guatavita, over 9,000 feet up in the Colombian Andes. You've been given coca leaves to chew, dressed in ceremonial clothes, and now priests are tying gold objects to your body. The lake below is a perfect circle, dark and still. Your community believes it's a portal to the underworld, and everything that goes in belongs to the gods. The MUISCA controlled the highlands of what is now Colombia, from around 600 to 1600 AD. They weren't one unified empire, just a confederation of chiefdoms that shared language, religion, and trade. Each had its own leader, but together, they controlled the fertile valleys around modern-day Bogota. They mined emeralds, worked gold into intricate objects, and farmed steep terraces. Trade tied everything together. Salt, emeralds, and gold were moved between chiefdoms through market towns. MUISCA merchants even traded with coastal and jungle communities for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Religion ran the show here. Sacred lakes were thought to be entrances to the spirit world. The most important was Lake Guatavita, a crater lake sitting over 9,000 feet up. Whenever a new chief took power, he had to undergo a ceremony at Guatavita. Sometime in 1537, Spanish conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada witnessed one of such ceremonies. The chief's body was covered in sticky resin, then coated in gold dust until he looked like a living statue. He paddled to the lake center on a raft with attendants carrying piles of gold figurines, emeralds, and valuables. Once they reached the middle, the chief dove in, washing off the gold. The attendants then threw everything else in as offerings. That ceremony was pretty fascinating. It happened regularly, and that's why it became the basis for the El Dorado legend. But there was another practice the Spanish documented that gets left out of the myth. A Spanish priest named Pedro Simon, writing in the early 1600s based on local accounts, described the MUISCA throwing living victims into the lakes when things got bad. Other Spanish chronicles add a bit more color. They say the victims were given coca leaves to chew, dressed in ceremonial clothes, then marched to the lake and dumped in with gold objects tied to their bodies. Normally, the MUISCA just threw gold into the lakes to keep the gods happy. Human offerings were only for when gold wasn't enough, when droughts lasted too long, disease spread, or enemies appeared. Pretty much anytime life became a nightmare. For decades, things kept going as well as they possibly could, all factors considered. Then the Spanish arrived between 1537 and 1600 and systematically destroyed the whole system. They conquered the chiefdoms, forced Christianity on everyone, and the lake ceremonies stopped. Within 3 generations, the language and most of the culture were gone. Most of the gold recovered from Lake Guatavita got melted down and shipped to Spain. Tier 2. Scythians. You're a Scythian warrior in 400 BC, and you just killed an enemy in battle. Instead of tossing the body aside and continuing the fight, you pull out a knife and start cutting a circle around his head. You plan to keep that piece of flesh, work it into a leather-like texture later, and tie it around your horse's bridle. The Scythians were warriors who controlled the Eurasian steppes from around the 7th century BC to the 3rd century BC. Their territory stretched across modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, and extended eastward towards Central Asia. Scythian society was divided into tribes led by chieftains, and pretty much everything revolved around war. They lived almost entirely on horseback, and never bothered with permanent cities. Their horses were bred for speed and endurance, which made Scythian warriors into deadly mounted archers who could fire accurately while riding at full gallop. Around 440 BC, Greek historian Herodotus traveled through Scythian territory and wrote down what he saw. According to him, Scythian warriors measured status by how many enemies they killed. But you couldn't just brag about it. Every kill had to be proven. And proof meant bringing back the enemy's scalp to your chieftain. After a fight, a warrior would cut a line from ear to ear around the head, grab the hair, and peel the scalp off in one piece. He'd scrape away the flesh, soften the skin like leather, and hang it from his horse's bridle. The more scalps you had flapping off your horse, the higher your rank, and the bigger your share of the loot. It sounds unhinged, which is probably why historians long assumed Herodotus was exaggerating. Then, in the 1990s, researchers examined Scythian-era skulls in Russian museum collections. Several adult male skulls had clean cut marks running from one ear to the other, exactly where you'd slice if you were removing a scalp. The marks were made by metal blades, and they lined up perfectly with Herodotus' description. Herodotus also mentioned skull cups. After defeating important enemies, the Scythians would saw off the top of the skull at the eyebrows, remove the brain, wrap rawhide around it for grip, and use it as a drinking vessel. The wealthier Scythians even coated the inside with gold. Archaeologists later confirmed this practice when excavations turned up skulls with their tops sawed off, edges worn smooth from repeated use, and some still bearing traces of gold fused into the bone. The Scythians were fierce warriors with plenty of questionable habits, but even that didn't make them immortal. By the 3rd century BC, they were slowly absorbed by other nomadic groups and expanding empires, and their culture gradually disappeared. Celts. Tène. It's 60 AD in what's now Britain, and Roman legions have been pushing into your territory for years. They have better weapons, stronger armor, and disciplined formations. Your people keep losing. Villages burn, warriors die, and land is taken. The Druids, your religious leaders, gather everyone and announces the gods need to be appeased, and you're the one chosen. The Celts were a group of tribes spread across Europe between roughly 700 BC and 400 AD, from Ireland and Britain through France and Spain into Central Europe. Each tribe had its own chieftain, and Druids, the powerful priestly class, oversaw religious and spiritual life. Life for the Celts included more than fighting. They farmed, traded, built hill forts, minted coins, and produced impressive metalwork. Religion was central. Forests, springs, rivers, and bogs were sacred, places where the human world met the spirit world. The Druids, the guys who ran the show, acted as judges, advisors, teachers, and religious leaders all at once. Celtic history, laws, and beliefs were never written down. Everything was memorized and passed on orally, which meant the Druids controlled the knowledge. And by controlling the knowledge, they controlled the culture. When the Romans started conquering Celtic lands, the imbalance was clear. Julius Caesar invaded Gaul in 58 BC and spent 8 years defeating tribes with tactics the Celts couldn't match. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius invaded Britain, and Roman legions kept winning. The Celts believed their gods controlled weather, crops, and the outcomes of battles. So when rain stopped, harvests failed, or Roman armies kept advancing, it was seen as a sign the gods were angry and demanded blood. That blood had to come from important people, high-status individuals, sometimes even druids themselves. That's where sacred bogs come in. Bogs were seen as doorways to the other world where the gods lived. If you wanted to send a message to the divine realm, you put it in a bog. And most of the time, that message was a person. Years later, workers cutting peat in a bog near Cheshire, England, pulled up a human head, perfectly preserved with skin, hair, and beard intact. The rest of the body was buried a bit deeper. Archaeologists later studied him and realized this man, now known as Lindo Man, had been a big shot of some kind. His hands showed no signs of hard labor, and his body was well-fed and healthy. This lines up with what we know about who the Druids sacrificed, believing it would convince the gods to turn the Romans back. It didn't. The Druid sacrifices didn't turn the tide. The Romans kept pushing forward and defeating Celtic forces at every turn. Over time, as Rome's influence grew and Christianity spread through the Celtic lands around 400 AD, the practice of bog sacrifices ended. The bodies stayed buried in the oxygen-free peat, which preserved them almost perfectly for more than 2,000 years. Today, museums hold these remains. Etruscans. You're a prisoner in 300 BC Etruria. A nobleman has just died. It's time for his funeral, and you have a part to play. You're dragged to the tomb, handed a sword, and shoved toward another captive. You're both already hurt and barely standing, but you have to fight because there's no alternative. When the other prisoner finally goes down, the crowd cheers as his blood soaks into the ground. They're happy because the spilled blood is exactly what the nobleman's spirit needs to get into the afterlife. The Etruscans lived in central Italy from around 900 BC to 27 BC, occupying what's now Tuscany. They built advanced cities with drainage systems, created detailed frescoes and sculptures, and developed a written language historians still can't fully translate. Etruscan society was organized into city-states ruled by kings or magistrates, and they grew wealthy, mining copper, iron, and tin in central Italy's hills. Early Rome was heavily influenced by Etruscans. Romans borrowed their alphabet, lifted architectural ideas like the arch, copied religious rituals, including reading omens from animal guts, and straight up took the toga from the Etruscans. To put it simply, Rome spent its early years running a Remix Everything Etruscan campaign, while the Etruscans ruled central Italy. With all that cultural influence came their religious ideas, like the belief that important dead people needed human blood to cross safely into the afterlife. Without it, the spirit would stick around and cause problems for the living family. Early on, the Etruscans went about it the direct way. When someone important died, they'd kill prisoners or slave right at the graveside during the funeral feast. Quick execution, blood on the ground, and the spirit was happy. Then, around the 4th century BC, someone decided funerals could use an upgrade. Instead of just executing prisoners, they armed 2 of them and forced them to fight to the death while the guests watched. It still satisfied the spirits, but now the funeral had added entertainment. It caught on fast. Wealthy Roman families started hosting their own funeral games, and over time, the religious meaning faded. By the 1st century BC, Roman officials were throwing massive state-funded gladiator shows to boost their popularity, and honoring the dead was barely a part of it anymore. What began as an Etruscan sacrifice had turned into Rome's biggest crowd pleaser. Gladiatorial combat lasted nearly 1,000 years, until Emperor Honorius banned it in 404 AD. Meanwhile, the Etruscans were gradually absorbed into Roman culture, and by 27 BC, their distinct identity had vanished. Tier 3. Tiwanaku. It's 610 AD, and you're being led up the steep stone steps of the Akapana Pyramid, more than 13,000 feet above sea level in what's now Bolivia. The altitude burns your lungs with every step. People watch from below, silent. At the top, priests are already waiting, and let's just say you won't be making the trip back down. The Tiwanaku civilization controlled parts of Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina from around 550 to 1000 AD. They built one of the highest urban centers in the ancient world near Lake Titicaca, and at their peak, around 800 AD, their capital held up to 60,000 people living at extreme altitude, where most civilizations couldn't survive. Tiwanaku ran on farming in a place where farming shouldn't work. It sits more than 13,000 feet above sea level. Frost can hit most nights. The air is thin. Crops should fail there, but they figured it out. They built raised fields called sucacalas. Picture long lifted strips of soil with canals of water running between them. During the day, the water soaked up heat from the sun, At night, it slowly released that heat and kept the crops from freezing. The canals also helped with drainage and kept the soil healthy. It was simple, but smart, and it fed tens of thousands of people. That food surplus is what allowed Tiwanaku to grow into a major city with huge stone temples. Right in the center stood the Akapana Pyramid. It had 7 levels and was shaped to look like a sacred mountain. Inside the pyramid, channels carried rainwater through the structure and out through carved stone heads. The Tiwanaku saw mountains as doorways between the human world and the gods, and the water flowing through the temple was meant to represent underground rivers that kept their crops alive. Their religion focused on fertility gods and water deities. The most important was Viracocha, a creator god carved into the gateway of the sun, holding 2 staffs with rays coming from his head and geometric tears streaming down his face. The tears represented rain, and the staffs represented his control over agriculture and water. When crops failed or droughts hit, the Tiwanaku believed Viracocha was angry and holding back the water. Their answer was human sacrifice at the top of the Akapana. During the killing ceremonies, victims were brought to the summit while crowds watched from below. They were killed, cut open, then dismembered and left for scavengers. Once the flesh was gone, the bones were buried around the temple as offerings. When archaeologists excavated the Akapana in the 1980s, they found at least 27 bodies and skulls, with evidence suggesting that several hundred more could still be buried there. By 1000 AD, a long drought hit the region, and Tiwanaku's raised fields stopped working when the water dried up. People left, the city emptied, and the sacrifices never brought the rain back. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1532, Tiwanaku had been abandoned for 500 years. Today, all that's left of the civilization, dismembered bones, skulls with cut marks, and stone figures clutching severed heads are in Bolivian museums. Philistines. You're building a new house in Ashkelon around 800 BC. The trenches are dug and the foundation is ready. Before the walls go up, and before anyone moves in, there's one last step everyone expects. A newborn is to be placed inside a storage jar and lowered into the ground beneath a doorway. The house will stand on top of this burial for centuries. This wasn't some one-off horror story. It was a known foundation ritual among the Philistines, the same people better remembered for fighting biblical heroes than for what they buried under their homes. They lived along the southern Mediterranean coast from around 1200 to 600 BC in what's now the Gaza Strip. They were skilled iron workers and seafaring traders who built 5 major cities and controlled Mediterranean trade routes. Philistine society was organized around 5 city-states, each ruled by a lord, forming a loose confederation. They weren't originally from the region. Evidence shows they migrated in from the Aegean, somewhere around Greece, bringing their own pottery styles, tools, and habits when they settled along the coast. They lived off farming, fishing, and sea trade, and they were early adopters of iron weapons back when ironworking was still new and intimidating. Outside Ashkelon, they had a proper adult ceremony with over 200 burials. Grown men and women laid out the way you would expect. What was missing were babies and young children. That alone raises a red flag. In the ancient world, infant mortality was brutal. Around a third of all children died before age 5. Statistically, that cemetery should have been full of tiny graves, but it wasn't, because the babies were never taken there. When archaeologists started digging at Ashkelon in 1985, more than 200 infant burials showed up under houses, tucked beneath doorways, sealed into walls, or placed under the corners of buildings. Every single one was put inside a storage jar or a cooking pot. Based on bone development, most of these infants died right around birth, usually within their first week. This fit with what people back then believed about protection and building safety. New houses need spiritual defenses. A fresh death, especially that of a newborn who hadn't lived long enough to do anything wrong, was thought to block evil spirits from entering. The buried infant acted as an offering to the gods, and a kind of supernatural security system for the family living above. Grim, yes, but to them it was practical. By 600 BC, Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the Philistine cities. Ashkelon was destroyed. The population was killed or enslaved, and Philistine culture disappeared. The foundation burial practice disappeared along with it. Olmecs. You've just had a baby in southern Mexico around 1600 BC. Before you can even settle in, priests arrive to inspect the newborn. They're checking for specific traits they believe mark a child as chosen by the jaguar god. Your baby has them. They tell you it's an honor. The child will be taken to El Manati, a sacred spring where water rises from the ground. What they don't say is that once the baby leaves with them, you'll never see your child again. The Olmecs were the first major civilization in the Americas, living from around 1600 to 400 BC in southern Mexico along the Gulf Coast. They built the first large ceremonial centers, developed the earliest American writing system, created a complex calendar, and carved massive stone heads weighing up to 20 tons. The Olmec society was organized around powerful rulers and priests who managed ceremonies and interpreted messages from gods. Their economy ran on maize farming, fishing, and trade networks, bringing jade and obsidian. They worked jade into carvings, produced rubber from local trees, and built massive earthen pyramids where thousands gathered for rituals. Their religion was obsessed with jaguars, the most dangerous predator around. To them, the big cats were more than just big cats. They were divine beings that moved between worlds. The Olmecs thought their rulers came from jaguars, and some kids were born as, well, something in between. Half human, half god. You see it in their art. Slanted eyes, downturned mouths, cleft heads, floppy little limbs. Basically, babies that looked a bit different. Some researchers think kids with conditions like cleft palates or Down syndrome fit the bill. When priests spotted a newborn like that, they didn't just coo and go home. They took the kid to one of the sacred springs. The springs were seen as doors to Xibalba, the underworld where the gods hung out. Water running from underground was thought to be a direct line to them. At El Manati near San Lorenzo, the babies were killed and tossed in with carved wooden gods, rubber balls, jade axes, and obsidian blades. The entire practice tied back to rain and crops. When droughts dragged on or harvests failed, the Olmecs believed the water gods were demanding some kind of payment. The children were seen as sacred and still close to the spirit world since they hadn't been on Earth long. After being killed, they were supposed to carry the community's pleas straight to the gods and beg for rain on their behalf. The Olmecs kept doing this for over 400 years. Infant remains at El Manati date from around 1600 to 1200 BC. So this wasn't a one-time emergency. It became a long-running ritual. Then, by around 400 BC, Olmec civilization collapsed. Centers were abandoned, stone heads were buried or smashed, and the spring was forgotten. Nobody knows exactly why. Maybe climate change, warfare, resource depletion, or some combination. Tier 4. CAHOKIA, Mississippian culture. You're a young woman living near the Mississippi River around 1100 AD. The city's most powerful leader just died, and priests have been walking through settlements selecting people. Today, they pick you, along with dozens of other women your age. You're brought to the largest mound, and today you'll be honored in the burial ceremony. What you don't know is that you won't make it out alive. CAHOKIA was built by the Mississippian culture between 600 and 1400 AD, near what's now St. Louis. At its peak, it was the biggest city north of Mexico, with tens of thousands of people living around massive earthen mounds that rose over 100 feet high. The people who controlled those mounds were more than just political leaders. They were considered living bridges between the human world and the divine. Mississippian religion was built around the idea of three worlds: the upper world of sky and birds, the middle world where humans lived, and the lower world of water and serpents. The elite acted as the link between them, and when a powerful leader died, that connection risked breaking. The only way to maintain it was to send the leader into the afterlife with everything needed to keep the universe balanced. When archaeologists started excavating Mount 72 in 1967, they began to see how that actually played out. At the center, a high-status male had been laid out on a platform made from over 20,000 shell beads arranged like a bird. Around him, they found dozens of young women, all between 15 and 25, placed in neat rows. All had been killed at the same time. 4 had their heads and hands removed, setting them apart from the others. The ages and arrangements suggest the women weren't chosen at random. Some may have been selected for purity or fertility symbolism, while the 4 with severed heads and hands were likely marked as special offerings. Their bodies showed no signs of resistance. We don't know if they believed their deaths were necessary, were restrained, or simply overpowered. What's clear is they were killed together, as part of the funeral. The sacrifices were meant to keep their world in order, but they must not have worked, because by 1400 AD, CAHOKIA was abandoned. CHIMU. You are an 8-year-old child in a CHIMU village on Peru's northern coast in 1450 AD. Priests are walking through the village examining children, and they're looking for healthy ones between ages 5 and 14. Today, they step in front of you. Your parents don't resist because these priests represent the CHIMU emperor, and what the empire needs, it gets. Moments later, you're marched to the beach with over 100 other children. The CHIMU Empire controlled 600 miles of Peru's coastline from around 900 to 1470 AD, making them the largest South American kingdom before the Inca. They built Chan, a city with over 60,000 residents, and developed irrigation systems that turned coastal desert into farmland. The CHIMU got wealthy from fishing and agriculture, and their economy ran almost entirely on what the ocean gave them. For 500 years, that worked out perfectly. Fish came in huge numbers, and the irrigation systems kept crops growing. Then, around 1400 to 1450 AD, everything went sideways. Massive flooding hit, destroyed the canals, wiped out crops, and sent fish populations crashing. The ocean that had fed them for centuries turned destructive. The CHIMU believed the ocean was a living deity called Ni. When the sea turned destructive, they saw it as Ni demanding something in return. Because criminals, prisoners, and adults weren't considered valuable enough, they chose healthy children instead, seeing them as the most precious offerings they could give. In 2011, archaeologists excavating a site at Huanchaquito Las Llamas, just outside of Chan, found a mass grave containing 140 children and 200 llamas, all killed on the same day. The children were between 5 to 14 years old, and each had a precise chest incision running from the sternum down to the heart. Rib bones showed cut marks where they had been pried apart, and some ribs were completely dislocated. The cuts were clean and methodical, clearly made by priests who knew exactly how to open a chest cavity and remove the heart while the victim was still alive. Before being killed, the children's faces were painted with red cinnabar. They were arranged in rows facing the ocean, and the priests went down the line performing the ritual one by one. Footprint analysis in the dried mud showed adults and children walking to the site together. There were no signs of struggle, and nothing to suggest the children tried to run. They were either restrained, drugged, or had accepted what was about to happen. After the hearts were removed, the bodies were buried in shallow graves on the beach. The flooding didn't stop, and by 1470 AD, the Inca had conquered the weakened CHIMU. Chan was abandoned, and the sacrifice site remained hidden for 550 years until construction workers stumbled across the bones in 2011. Excavations are still ongoing, and in 2018, archaeologists uncovered another nearby site with 250 more bodies. DILMUN. You're the son of a wealthy Mesopotamian merchant in 1800 BC, and your father just died. You're standing at the docks watching workers carefully load his wrapped body onto a ship heading south to DILMUN. The voyage isn't cheap. You've paid a fortune for it, but you think it's worth it because you believe burial on that specific island will give your father eternal life. DILMUN was an island civilization in what is now Bahrain, active from around 3000 to 600 BC. It sat along major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Arabia, which made its people wealthy middlemen. DILMUN merchants moved copper, pearls, dates, and textiles between major civilizations and built their wealth by controlling that trade. Their religion centered on the belief that DILMUN was sacred and that the usual rules of death did not apply there. Sumerian and Babylonian texts described it as a literal paradise, a pure land where sickness and death supposedly did not exist. Some writings even claimed it was the place where flood survivors were taken by the gods to live forever. According to this belief, being buried in DILMUN meant achieving eternal life. There was just one problem. The island was not big enough. Today, DILMUN has more than 170,000 burial mounds, covering nearly a third of Bahrain. At its peak, around 50,000 people lived there at any given time. Even if you buried every person who ever lived on the island across its 2,400-year history, the numbers still would not add up. There were simply too many graves. The scale only makes sense if the dead were coming from somewhere else, which they were. Because of its reputation, DILMUN became a sought-after burial destination. Wealthy Mesopotamians began sending their dead there in large numbers. Cuneiform tablets record ships traveling between Mesopotamia and DILMUN carrying cargo. That cargo included corpses. Families paid substantial fees to have their deceased relatives transported to the sacred island and buried there. When archaeologists opened mounds in the 1950s and 60s, they found chambers packed with bodies. Some had 15 to 20 people crammed in spaces originally meant to fit just one or two. Analysis showed these people all died around the same time, so these were mass burials, not family plots. The sheer number of graves suggests something systematic was happening. We don't know exactly how it worked, but it's possible the people of DILMUN saw how much demand there was and built an industry around it. When the ships arrived, priests would perform elaborate rituals, promising eternal life to grieving families. And then, the bodies would get crammed into tombs as quickly as possible to make room for the next shipment. For a while, business was good, but by 600 BC, trade routes shifted and DILMUN lost importance. The civilization collapsed, but the burial mounds stayed. Modern development keeps uncovering more, and only about 10% have been excavated so far. Tier 5, COLCHIS. It's around 500 BC, and you've been captured after a raid near the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Your weapons are gone, and your hands are tied. Instead of being taken to a prison or sold, you're led into a quiet forest. The trees seem taller the deeper you go, and you notice rusted weapons, bones, and old offerings hanging from the branches. COLCHIS sat on the eastern Black Sea coast, in what's now Georgia, from around 1300 to 200 BC. They controlled the mountain passes where trade routes from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East crossed, which made them rich middlemen. The mountains were full of gold, silver, and copper, and COLCHIS mined it all, turning raw metal into jewelry and ritual objects to trade for wine, grain, and other goods they couldn't grow themselves. Society was run by regional chiefs and a powerful priestly class who oversaw religious ceremonies. Their most famous trick was their gold extraction method. They'd put wool in rivers flowing from gold-rich mountains. The fibers would catch tiny particles, and once enough collected, they'd burn or beat the wool to get the gold. That's where the Greek myth of the golden fleece came from. But the Greeks weren't just fascinated by the gold. They also wrote about a darker side of Colchian life. Apparently, the Colchians had a tradition of sacrificing war captives to their war god. They even had sacred groves where prisoners were killed and hung from trees as offerings. For a long time, historians assumed this was just Greek propaganda. Stories designed to make foreigners look barbaric and make the Greeks seem superior. Then, excavations in Georgia started turning up evidence that matched the Greek accounts. Burial sites revealed bodies arranged in ritual positions, some with slit throats. Human remains were buried beneath trees in areas that looked like sacred groves. At Vani, a major Colchian center, archaeologists uncovered a ritual complex with human and animal bones mixed together, ceremonial weapons, and altars that still showed traces of blood. By 200 BC, the Persian Empire conquered Colchis. The culture faded, sacred groves were abandoned, and the sacrifices stopped. JŌMON culture. It's around 3000 BC in prehistoric Japan, and you're about to become an adult. There's no party waiting for you. Instead, elders arrive looking for you, and a few others of your age. Nobody explains much, but you already know why they're here. Without arguing, you sit down, hold still, and endure it. When it's over and the pain fades, something is gone. Every time you open your mouth for the rest of your life, everyone can see it. The JŌMON culture existed in Japan from around 1400 to 300 BC, making them one of the world's oldest pottery-making societies. They were hunter-gatherers who never developed agriculture, but still created permanent settlements, surviving on fish, shellfish, and wild plants for over 13,000 years. These people made elaborate pottery and strange clay figurines called dogu that they'd carefully craft, then deliberately smash and bury. Nobody knows why they did this, but their figurines weren't the only things that were damaged. When archaeologists examined JŌMON skeletal remains, they noticed something unusual. A huge percentage of adults were missing their front teeth, specifically upper and lower incisors. The teeth had been deliberately pulled out while the owners were alive, and the pattern was too consistent to be anything but intentional. Turns out in JŌMON Japan, you didn't need an ID. Missing front teeth did the job just fine. The tooth extraction seems to have been some kind of ritual, and it happened across JŌMON society for thousands of years. It usually took place during adolescence as a coming-of-age ceremony. The teeth were removed in specific patterns depending on where you lived and when. Some groups pulled only the upper incisors, some only the lower, and some took teeth from both jaws in neat, symmetrical rows. The JŌMON believed this ritual marked important life transitions. Pulling out healthy teeth without anesthesia was a painful ordeal that demonstrated courage and acceptance into adult society. The missing teeth became a permanent marker that you'd passed the ritual and earned your place. But it went beyond coming of age. Some researchers think tooth extraction had spiritual significance tied to JŌMON beliefs about transformation. They believed the mouth was a portal, so removing teeth might have been about connecting with ancestors or gods. Still, some people think the practice was just to show your place in society or which group you belong to. Whatever the reason, it was done all over. Looking at the skeletons, about 70 to 80% of adults had their teeth removed. This was a normal part of life for thousands of years across Japan. By around 300 BC, rice farming came from mainland Asia, and JŌMON society changed. The new farming culture didn't remove teeth. The practice ended, and whatever meaning those missing incisors had went with the people who understood it. Keros Syros culture. Imagine it's 2600 BC, and you sailed to a tiny rocky island called Keros in the middle of the Aegean Sea. There are no towns, no houses, and no farms. The ground is littered with broken marble figures. Their arms are folded, faces blank, and many are snapped at the neck or broken at the waist and legs. Archaeologists think these objects were made on other Cycladic islands and carried here just to be smashed. The people who made them are part of the Keros Syros culture, which existed between 2700 and 2300 BC. They lived across the Cyclades, small islands scattered through the sea, and they spent a lot of time sailing between them. They built little coastal settlements, farmed what they could, and carved marble figurines that look shockingly modern. You've probably seen them in museums. Keros itself wasn't a place where people lived. On the west side, at a site called Deskaliokavos, archaeologists didn't find homes or graves. They found fragments, thousands of them. Broken figurines, marble bowls, and vessels were smashed and left behind. Tests show many of these objects were made far away, sometimes dozens of miles across the sea, and brought here specifically to be destroyed. The breaking wasn't random. Heads came off bodies, limbs were snapped, and the same patterns appear over and over. The people knew the rules, which shows this was a ritual everyone understood. Nearby, on a small islet called Descalio, they reshaped the rock into a stepped, pyramid-like structure using tons of imported stone. They carved drainage channels into the bedrock and worked copper there. The whole thing was pretty organized. Basically, Keros was a sacred center. People brought powerful objects, killed them by breaking them, and left them behind. This might have been offerings to gods, ancestors, or something else we don't fully understand. Intact figures are almost never found on the island, which proves that destroying them was the point of the ritual. By around 2300 BC, the Keros Syros culture faded. Outside influences grew. The ritual network collapsed and the island was abandoned. The meaning behind the broken figures was lost. What's left today is a landscape full of carefully shattered objects. Tier 6. Guanche, Canary Islands. It's 1402 AD. You're part of the Spanish troops and you've just landed on an island most people back home know nothing about. The people here don't build boats. They don't trade with outsiders. And they seem completely cut off from the wider world. You quickly realize they are trapped by their own geography. The Canary Islands sit 60 miles off the coast of North Africa. And over generations, the Guanche lost the ability to build seafaring vessels. Once they arrived, there was no way to leave, no contact with other civilizations, and no access to metal tools or new resources. Isolation shaped everything about life here, and eventually, even the memory of the outside world faded. The Guanche were Berber descendants who settled the island sometime between 1000 BC and 500 BC. Their society was organized into kingdoms ruled by chiefs called menses. They lived in caves and stone structures, raised goats and pigs, farmed barley and wheat in volcanic soil, and fished along the coast. Religion centered on a supreme god and ancestor worship, and this influenced how they treated their dead. When someone important died, families called in embalmers who could preserve bodies for long periods. They removed organs, washed the body in salt water, and packed it with aromatic plants and herbs and dried it in the sun for weeks. The mummies were kept in caves, and families visited them for generations. These preservation methods were so advanced that they outperformed what the Egyptians were doing at the same time, all while using only local resources and tools. At the same time, human bones from pre-Spanish sites show something much darker. Many remains show cut marks, broken bones, likely for marrow extraction, evidence of roasting, and systematic removal of muscle from the arms, legs, and torso. Spanish chronicles later described Guanche warriors eating parts of enemies they killed in battle. Whether this was purely ritual or sometimes a response to famine is unclear, but the evidence shows humans were processed in ways similar to animals. In 1402, the Spanish arrived to conquer the islands. The Guanche resisted for decades, but stone tools were no match for steel weapons and gunpowder. Diseases brought by Europeans spread quickly. Survivors were enslaved, and within a century, the conquest was complete. Some final holdouts chose mass suicides by jumping off cliffs rather than surrender. Within 100 years of first contact, the Guanche population was gone. Their language disappeared. Their culture disappeared. And most of the mummies were looted, destroyed, or shipped to European collections. A few survived and are now held in museums. CUCUTENi TRYPHILLA. You're a villager in what's now Ukraine around 4000 BC, living in a two-story house in a settlement of hundreds of families arranged in perfect circles. Life has been good here for decades. Crops grow well, livestock are healthy. Overall, your community is thriving. And one day, the elders announce it's time. Time for what? You're not entirely sure, but everyone starts preparing. You watch your neighbors carefully pack certain belongings while leaving others behind. And you notice some of the older members of your community aren't packing anything at all. The CUCUTENi TRYPHILLA culture existed across Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova from around 5500 to 2750 BC. At their peak, around 4000 BC, they built some of the world's largest Stone Age settlements, villages with hundreds of two-story houses arranged in perfect circles, some holding over 15,000 people. They made elaborately painted pottery, worked copper into tools, practiced organized agriculture, and raised cattle and sheep. Their society had specialized craftspeople and religious leaders way ahead of most cultures at the time. Instead, they found something strange. Every house in these settlements had burned at roughly the same time. The fires were so intense, they baked the clay walls into ceramic. Walls collapsed inward, roofs caved in, but inside, pottery and tools were still in place. No signs of looting, no evidence of a rushed escape. So, if it wasn't an accident and it wasn't an attack, what was it? The burns were too consistent across entire settlements to be random. It looked deliberate, organized. But that raises the obvious question. Why would a community burn down its own village? Then, archaeologists found human remains inside some of the houses. Not all, but enough to notice a pattern. The bodies were inside when the fires started, and some showed no signs of trying to get out. That suggests at least a few of them were already dead or unable to move before the flames were set. The current theory is that the CUCUTENi TRYPHILLA believed in cyclical destruction and rebirth. Every 60 to 80 years, their settlement's life cycle ended, and everything associated with that cycle needed to be destroyed. The buildings, the tools, the pottery, and in some cases, people who were too old or sick to make the journey to the next settlement. The fires usually started from one side of the village and spread in a controlled wave across the entire settlement. After burning everything, the survivors would move nearby and build a new settlement with the same circular pattern. New houses, new pottery, new everything. Then, 60 to 80 years later, they'd do it all over again. They did this for more than 2,000 years. Eventually, around 2750 BC, the culture declined, likely because of climate pressure, steppe migrations, internal strain, or some combination of all three. What remains today are dozens of intentionally burned settlements scattered across Eastern Europe. Dorset culture. It's 1500 AD, and you're an Inuit hunter in northern Canada, tracking caribou when you come across a stone shelter you don't recognize. You step inside and see tools laid out and half-finished ivory carvings on a work surface. It looks like people just stepped out for a moment. You check another shelter and find the same thing. Everything's still there, but there are no people, no bodies, and no graves. The Dorset culture emerged around 500 BC and lived across the Arctic, stretching from Alaska to Greenland. They survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth by hunting seals, walrus, and caribou. They used toggling harpoons that stayed lodged in their prey, built shelters from ice blocks, and hunted seals at breathing holes in thick ice during months of total darkness. They lived in small, mobile family groups of around 20 to 50 people, moving with the seasons and following animal migrations. The system worked so well that they thrived for well over 1,000 years. Then, around 1000 AD, they just vanished. Across sites spread over thousands of miles, archaeologists found shelters that looked like they'd been recently occupied. It all points to communities that left their homes and never returned. Yet no one knows exactly what happened. The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, moved into the Arctic around the same time the Dorset disappeared. Some researchers have suggested there may have been conflict between the two groups, but there are no battle sites, no mass graves, no weapons lodged in bones, and no clear signs of warfare. If violence was the cause, there's little physical evidence to support it. Climate change is another theory. Around 1000 AD, the medieval warm period shifted Arctic ice patterns and likely affected seal populations the Dorset depended on. It's possible hunting became harder. The issue is that climate decline usually shows up gradually, with shrinking settlements or signs of stress over time. Dorset sites don't really show that. Instead, they suggest ordinary activity that simply stopped. Disease has also been considered as a potential explanation. Maybe the Thule brought an illness with them, and it spread fast through small Dorset communities. In that scenario, people could have died in their shelters before anyone had the chance to bury them. And over time, Arctic scavengers and shifting ground erased the remains. The problem with this line of thinking is that even epidemics usually leave skeletal evidence, and researchers have not found large numbers of Dorset remains from this period. Some researchers point to starvation during especially harsh winters. If sea ice shifted and hunting failed, entire family groups could have been trapped without enough food. Over time, scavengers in the freeze-thaw cycle could have scattered and broken down the bodies. That would help explain the abandoned sites, but it still relies on conditions lining up across a massive region, and the archaeological record does not clearly show a long, drawn-out collapse. Then there's the DNA. When researchers tested modern Inuit populations, they didn't find Dorset genetic markers. That tells us the Dorset weren't absorbed, and they didn't leave descendants behind.